Roy pulled his small boat alongside the old ship just as the sun was going down. The ship had been sitting in the far corner of the harbor for years. Nobody went near it anymore. The wood was dark and swollen from years of rain. The ropes that once held it to the dock had long since rotted away. It drifted slightly with the water, creaking and groaning like it was tired of floating. He tied his boat to a rusted iron ring on the ship's side and climbed up. The old ladder bent under his weight but held. Roy was not a big man, but he was strong in the quiet way that men get when they spend their whole lives lifting and carrying. His hands were rough. His boots were worn thin at the soles. He carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and a lantern in his other hand. He was not expecting much. He never did on jobs like this. Someone at the dock office had told him the old ship might have copper fittings below deck. Copper was worth something. Even old copper, green and dull, could be cleaned and sold. That was enough reason for Roy to come. He stepped onto the main deck and looked around. Everything was in bad shape. The wooden planks bent slightly under his boots. Some had split open completely, showing the dark water below. Old barrels sat along the sides, their lids gone, full of nothing but rainwater and leaves. A torn piece of sail hung from a broken mast, flapping slowly in the evening wind. Roy walked carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight down. He had done this enough times to know that old ships could give way without warning. One wrong step and a man could go straight through the floor. He found the hatch to the lower deck near the middle of the ship. The hinges were rusted solid, but Roy pulled a short iron bar from his bag and worked at it. After a few minutes of effort, the hatch groaned open. Cold, damp air came up from below. It smelled like old wood and still water and something else he could not name. Roy climbed down the short ladder into the lower deck. He held his lantern up and looked around. The space was low and narrow. Old crates were stacked along both walls, most of them falling apart. Some had spilled their contents onto the floor, broken glass, rotted cloth, rusted nails. The floor was wet in places where water had come in through cracks in the hull. He moved slowly down the middle, checking the crates. Most were worthless. He found one copper pipe, bent and green, and set it near the ladder to take back later. Not much, but something. He was almost ready to leave when he heard it. It was faint. So faint that he stopped and stood completely still, thinking he had imagined it. The ship creaked around him. Water lapped against the hull outside. Then it came again. A small sound. High and thin. Like something trying very hard to cry but not having the strength to do it properly. Roy turned slowly, holding the lantern out. He looked down the far end of the lower deck, where the shadows were deepest. There was a large crate there, bigger than the others, pushed into the corner. The lid was half on, half off. Something had knocked it loose from the inside. He walked toward it. His boots splashed softly in the shallow water on the floor. The sound came again, a little louder now that he was closer. It was not a rat. He had heard plenty of rats in old ships. This was different. This was sadder. Roy reached the crate and held his lantern over the open side. He did not move for a long moment. Inside the crate, curled into the tightest ball it could manage, was a dragon hatchling. It was tiny. Small enough that Roy could have held it in both hands with room to spare. Its scales were dark, almost black, but they caught the lantern light and showed a deep green underneath. Its wings were folded tight against its body. Its eyes were closed. Its whole small body was shaking. It cried again. That same thin, broken sound. Roy crouched down slowly and looked at it for a long time. He looked around the crate. There was nothing else in it. No shell pieces. No nesting material. No sign of a mother or any other creature. Just the hatchling, alone in the cold, dark corner of an abandoned ship. He reached out slowly and placed 2 fingers gently on its side. It flinched at first, pulling tighter into its ball. But the warmth of his hand stayed there, steady and calm, and after a moment the shaking slowed just a little. Roy sat back on his heels and let out a long breath. He looked at the single copper pipe near the ladder. He looked back at the hatchling. He picked up the pipe and tossed it aside. It clattered on the wet floor and was still. He took off his coat. It was old and heavy, lined with wool on the inside. He laid it open in the bottom of his canvas bag and then, slowly and carefully, he lifted the hatchling with both hands. It was lighter than he expected. It made a weak sound as he moved it but did not fight him. He lowered it gently into the coat and folded the wool around it. Roy picked up his bag, held it carefully against his chest and climbed back up to the deck. The evening air was cold and the harbor was quiet. He climbed back down to his small boat and sat for a moment, the bag held against him, feeling the faint tremble inside it slowly begin to settle. He started rowing back toward the dock lights. Roy got back to the dock just as the last light left the sky. The water was black and still. Most of the other workers had gone home. A few lanterns burned along the dock edges, swaying in the small wind coming off the water. His boots hit the wooden planks and he walked fast, the canvas bag held carefully against his chest with both arms. His workshop was at the far end of the dock. It was not much to look at. A single room built from old planks with a low roof and one small window. Inside there was a workbench along one wall, shelves of tools and parts, a small iron stove in the corner, and a cot where Roy sometimes slept when jobs ran late. It smelled like oil and sawdust and rust. It was warm when the stove was going and cold when it was not. Roy pushed the door open with his shoulder and went straight to the stove. He set the bag down on the cot, gently, and got the stove going with wood shavings and a match. His hands were quick and practiced. The fire caught fast. He fed it 2 small logs and left the stove door open a little so the heat spread out into the room. Then he went back to the bag. He opened it slowly and folded back the coat. The hatchling was still curled tight, still trembling, but her eyes were open now. They were pale green, almost yellow, and they looked up at Roy without blinking. She did not move. She just watched him. Roy pulled the cot closer to the stove. He left the hatchling wrapped in the coat and went to his shelves. He found an old tin bowl and wiped it clean. He filled it with water from the jug on his bench and set it near the cot. Then he looked at his small food box in the corner. He had some dried bread, a piece of hard cheese, and a cloth-wrapped parcel of leftover meat from the market that morning. Salted fish and a bit of dark beef already cooked. He pulled off a small piece of the beef and held it out toward the hatchling. She looked at it. She looked at Roy. She did not move. He tried again, holding it closer. She turned her head away and tucked her nose back under her wing. Roy sat back and looked at her. Her ribs showed slightly when she breathed. Her breathing was slow and shallow. He did not know how long she had been in that crate. He did not know when she had last eaten anything. He put the meat in the bowl and left it beside her and went to sit on his bench stool, watching from a distance, giving her space. That was when the door opened. Old Mara stood in the doorway with a shawl over her shoulders and a look on her face that said she already knew something was going on. Mara ran the herb stall 3 spots down from Roy's workshop. She was a small, thin woman with white hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had lived on the dock longer than most people could remember. She looked at Roy. She looked at the cot. She walked in without being invited, which was her usual way. She crouched beside the cot and looked at the hatchling for a long moment without touching her. The hatchling watched Mara the same way she had watched Roy. So, waiting. Mara stood up and looked at Roy. She did not say anything about how strange the situation was or ask him how this had happened. She simply said she needs warmth first, food second, and quiet most of all. Roy nodded. Mara left and came back 10 minutes later with a small pot, a bundle of dried herbs, and a piece of cloth so soft it looked like it had been washed 100 times. She heated water on the stove and added a pinch of the herbs, just enough to make the air in the room smell faintly green and clean. She soaked the soft cloth in the warm water, wrung it out, and laid it gently over the hatchling's back. The hatchling stiffened for a moment. Then something in her settled. Her trembling slowed. Her breathing changed, becoming a little deeper, a little steadier. Roy watched all of this from his stool and said nothing. Through the night they took turns. Mara showed Roy how to keep the cloth warm and how to replace it when it cooled. She showed him how to offer water on the tip of a finger rather than from a bowl, which was too large and too open for something so small and frightened. Roy did everything she showed him without question. He was not a man who asked too many questions when someone clearly knew more than he did. The hatchling did not eat. But she did not get worse either. Around the middle of the night she shifted her position for the first time, uncurling slightly from her tight ball. One small wing spread out a little and then folded back. Roy saw it from across the room and felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized was tight. Mara dozed on the stool near the stove for a few hours. Roy sat on the floor beside the cot with his back against the wall. Just before morning, when the sky outside the small window was turning from black to gray, Roy heard a soft lapping sound. He looked over. The hatchling had her head over the edge of the tin bowl. She was drinking. Slowly, carefully, with long pauses between each small sip. But she was drinking on her own. Roy watched her and did not move and did not speak. Mara opened one eye from the stool, looked at the bowl, and closed it again. The corner of her mouth moved just slightly. Outside, the first dock workers began arriving for the morning shift, their boots loud on the planks. Inside the small workshop, everything stayed quiet and still. 3 days passed. Then 4. Then a week. The hatchling did not leave the workshop at first. She stayed on the cot near the stove, sleeping most of the day, waking to eat small pieces of meat that Roy cut into strips no bigger than his thumbnail. She was still weak, but each day was a little better than the one before. Her trembling stopped completely by the third day. By the fourth, she was lifting her head when Roy came through the door. On the fifth day, Roy was sitting at his workbench fixing a pulley mechanism for one of the fishing boats. He had the parts spread out in front of him and was working quietly, turning each piece in his hands and checking where the wear was worst. He did not hear her move. But after a while he felt something press against his left boot. He looked down. The hatchling was sitting beside his foot, looking up at him. She had climbed off the cot on her own and crossed the workshop floor without making a sound. She just sat there watching him work like she had been doing it her whole life. Roy looked at her for a moment. Then he went back to his pulley. She stayed there until he was done. That was how it started. After that she followed him. Not sometimes. Always. Wherever Roy went inside the workshop, she was 2 steps behind. When he went to the shelves, she went to the shelves. When he moved to the stove, she moved to the stove. When he sat, she sat. She never made noise about it. She simply went where he went, quiet and steady, like a small dark shadow that had decided he was the most important thing in the world. Roy named her on the 6th day. He had not planned to. He was holding her near the stove, warming her after a cold night, and the lantern light caught her scales just right, showing that deep green gold underneath the black. He looked at it for a moment and said quietly and without thinking, "You look like an ember in the dark." She looked up at him when he said it. He said it again. Ember. She made a small sound, low and soft, not quite a growl and not quite a purr, something between the two. Roy took that as agreement and the name stuck. Mara came by each morning for the first 2 weeks, checking on Ember's weight and breathing and the color of her scales. She brought small amounts of a thick broth she made from bones and herbs and showed Roy how to mix it with the meat strips to give Ember more strength. Roy followed the instructions carefully and kept a mental note of everything Mara told him. One morning Mara looked at Ember for a long time and then told Roy that she was female. Roy nodded like he had already suspected as much. Mara said female dragon young bond faster and deeper than males. She said it once, clearly, and then moved on to checking Ember's wing joints without another word about it. Roy thought about that for the rest of the day. By the 2nd week, Ember was eating well and moving around the workshop with confidence. She explored every corner, sniffed every shelf, and climbed onto the workbench once to investigate Roy's tools. She knocked a wrench onto the floor and looked at it, then looked at Roy. Roy picked it up and put it back. She knocked it off again. Roy looked at her. She looked back at him. He left the wrench on the floor and went back to work. She seemed satisfied with that. People on the dock started to notice. Dot, who worked 2 boats down and mended nets most mornings outside her storage shed, saw Ember sitting in the workshop doorway one afternoon watching the water. Dot stopped and stared. Roy came to the door and stood beside Ember and said simply, "Found her on the old ship." Dot nodded slowly and went back to her nets. She was a practical woman and did not ask more than she needed to. Young Pip, the dock boy who ran messages and carried small loads for anyone who paid him a coin, was less calm about it. He came running to the workshop doorway one morning and skidded to a stop when he saw Ember on the workbench. His eyes went wide. Ember's head came up immediately and she let out a low, sharp growl that was much bigger than her size suggested. Pip took 2 fast steps back. Roy told him to move slowly and not stare directly at her. Pip did exactly that, and after a few minutes Ember lowered her head and went back to watching Roy work. Pip stood in the doorway for a long time after that, very still, with the look of someone who had just seen something they would talk about for the rest of their life. Not everyone reacted that way. Some of the older dock workers gave the workshop a wider path than before. A boat captain named Finn stopped Roy on the dock one afternoon and told him flatly that keeping a wild creature near working boats was asking for trouble. Roy listened to the whole thing without interrupting and then said he understood and walked back to his workshop. Ember was waiting just inside the door. She pressed her head against his hand the moment he sat down. That was the other thing she did. Whenever Roy sat down tired, at the end of a long day, she would come to wherever he was and press the top of her head against his hand. Not pushing. Just resting there. Roy would sit with his hand on her head without thinking about it, the way a person does when something has quietly become part of their daily life. He talked to her too. He had not meant to start doing it, but it happened naturally, the same way the name had happened. He would be working and say something out loud about what he was doing or about the weather or about a difficult job on one of the boats. Ember would sit nearby and listen with her head slightly tilted. She never answered, of course. But she never stopped listening either. Roy had lived alone on the dock for 11 years. He had not noticed how quiet it was until it wasn't anymore. It was an ordinary morning when they came. Roy was outside the workshop sanding down a cracked door, sitting on an upturned crate with Ember beside him on the planks. She had her eyes half closed in the morning sun, her dark scales warming slowly, her tail curled loosely around her feet. The dock was busy with its usual sounds. Ropes being pulled. Nets being dropped. Boots on wood. Gulls overhead. Roy heard them before he saw them. Not because they were loud but because the dock went quieter than usual. That kind of quiet that happens when people stop what they are doing and watch something coming. He looked up. 3 men were walking down the main dock toward him. They were not dock men. Their boots were too clean and their coats too fitted for working near water. 2 of them were large, with the kind of build that came from physical work of a different sort. They carried no weapons that Roy could see, but they carried themselves like men who did not expect to be told no. The 3rd man was smaller and thinner, walking slightly ahead of the other 2, holding a folded set of papers in one hand. Ember opened her eyes. She lifted her head and looked at the 3 men. The low sound started in her throat before they had even stopped walking. Not loud. Just there. A warning that Roy felt more than heard. He put his hand briefly on her back. She went quiet but did not look away from the men. The thin man stopped a few feet from Roy and held out the papers without greeting him. He said his name was Aldrin and that he worked for the Regional Wildlife Authority. He said there had been a report of an unregistered wild creature being kept at the dock. He said the papers gave him the legal right to assess and collect any wild animal deemed a risk to the public. Roy took the papers. He read them slowly and carefully. He was not a fast reader but he was a thorough one. The 2 large men stood behind Aldrin and said nothing. Ember had moved by the time Roy finished reading. She was behind his legs, pressed against the back of his calves, her whole body low to the ground. She was shaking. Not the weak trembling of a sick animal, but the tight, controlled shaking of something that was frightened and trying very hard not to show it. Roy could feel her against his legs without looking down. He folded the papers and held them back out to Aldrin. He said, "She is not a wild animal. She was abandoned. I found her." Aldrin said it did not matter how she was found. What mattered was that she was an unregistered dragon and unregistered dragons could not be kept by private individuals without a bonding declaration filed with the town council. He said no such declaration had been filed. He said the papers required Roy to hand the animal over that morning. Roy said nothing for a moment. He looked at the papers again, then at Aldrin, then at the 2 large men behind him. Dot had stopped mending her nets. Pip had appeared from somewhere further down the dock and was standing very still near a post, watching. A few other dock workers had drifted closer without seeming to, the way people do when something is happening that they feel they should witness. Roy said he wanted to speak to the town council directly before anything was handed over to anyone. Aldrin said that was not necessary. The papers were already approved. Roy said he understood that. He said he still wanted to speak to the council. There was a pause. Aldrin looked at him with the expression of a man who was used to people being difficult and had learned to wait it out. Roy looked back at him with no particular expression at all. He was not angry. He was not nervous. He was simply not moving. Aldrin said fine. He said Roy could appear before the council that afternoon. But the creature would need to be secured while the matter was discussed. Roy said she would stay in his workshop with the door shut and that was securing enough. Aldrin looked at the workshop, looked at Ember and after a moment nodded once. He said the council meeting would be at the 3rd hour after midday at the hall on the main road. He said Roy should bring whatever he had to say. The 3 men turned and walked back down the dock the way they had come. The dock sounds slowly came back. Ropes and nets and boots and gulls. Roy stood where he was for a moment, then reached down and picked Ember up. She was heavier than when he had first found her but she still fit against his chest with room. She pressed her head hard under his chin and the shaking began to slow. He carried her inside and sat on the cot with her in his lap. She stayed pressed against him and did not move. Roy sat with her quietly for a while. He was not a man who panicked. He had spent enough years dealing with broken boats and bad weather and jobs that went wrong to know that panicking did not fix anything. He thought carefully about what he had read in those papers and what he needed to say and who might help him say it. After a while he set Ember gently on the cot and stood up. He went to find Mara first. Then Dot. Then young Glenn from the far end of the dock who sometimes sat on the council for community matters and who Roy had fixed a boat engine for twice without charging full price. He had 3 days. The council had given him that much. He intended to use every hour of it. The 3 days were not wasted. Roy did not spend them arguing or worrying. He spent them talking to people. Quietly, one at a time, the way he did everything. He went to Mara first and she listened without interrupting and said she would come. He went to Dot, who put down her nets, looked at him for a long moment and said she would be there. He went to Glenn, who was young and still believed that simple truth said plainly was worth something in a council room. Glenn said he would not only come but would speak on Roy's behalf from inside the council itself. Word spread along the dock the way it always did. Quietly and quickly. By the second day, several of the other dock workers had told Roy they would come and sit in the hall. Not to cause trouble. Just to be there. Roy thanked each of them simply and did not make more of it than it was. He spent the evenings in the workshop with Ember. She knew something was different. Animals always do. She stayed closer to him than usual during those 3 days, rarely more than a step away, watching his face when he sat thinking. Roy talked to her in the evenings the way he always did. He told her what was happening in plain words, not because he thought she understood every word, but because it felt right to tell her. She listened with her head tilted and her pale green eyes steady on his face. On the morning of the third day, Roy washed his face, put on his least worn coat, and walked to the council hall with Ember walking beside him on the dock planks. She had never walked the full length of the main dock before. She stayed close to his left side and looked at everything with calm, careful eyes. People they passed either stepped back or nodded at Roy. Nobody bothered them. The council hall was a plain building on the main road above the dock. It had long wooden benches inside and a raised table at the front where 5 council members sat. Aldrin was already there with his 2 large men standing along the side wall. The hall was more full than Roy had expected. The dock people had come. They sat on the benches quietly, their working clothes still smelling of salt and rope and fish. Mara sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap. Dot sat beside her. Pip had squeezed in at the end of a bench near the back and was sitting very straight. Roy walked to the front of the hall and stood before the council table. Ember walked with him and sat down beside his left boot, straight and still, and looked at the council members without blinking. There was a brief silence in the hall. One of the older council members leaned forward and looked at Ember with an expression that was hard to read. Then the head of the council, a broad woman named Agnes, asked Roy to say what he had come to say. Roy did not have notes. He had thought about what he wanted to say for 3 days and he knew it well enough to say it plainly. He said he found Ember on an abandoned ship in the far corner of the harbor. He said she was in a rusted crate, alone, cold and crying. He said there was no mother, no shell, no sign that anyone was coming back for her. He said he did not plan to take her. He said he just could not leave her there. He said he brought her home and kept her warm through the night and that old Mara had helped him do it. He said Ember had been sick and weak and that she had chosen on her own to eat, to drink, to follow him, and to stay. He said he had not trained her or trapped her or tied her. He said she was free to go at any moment and that she never went. He said simply, I found her crying and alone. I stayed. She chose me back. That is the whole of it. The hall was quiet when he finished. Agnes looked at Mara and asked if she could confirm what Roy had said. Mara stood up and in a clear, steady voice said she could confirm every word of it and added that Ember was healthy, calm, and showed no aggression except in the natural way of a bonded creature protecting the person she had chosen. She said she had worked with animals her whole life and that what she saw between Roy and Ember was not a man keeping a wild animal. It was a bond. And bonds, she said, were not made by people. They were made by the animals themselves. Glenn spoke next from his seat at the council table. He said the law on unregistered dragons was written to prevent people from capturing and keeping wild creatures against their nature. He said this situation was the opposite of that. He said the law had a provision for abandoned young and for natural bonding and that this case met both conditions clearly. He placed a folded document on the table that he had prepared over the 3 days, written carefully and properly, and pushed it toward Agnes. Agnes read it. She passed it to the other council members. Aldrin spoke briefly, restating his earlier points about registration and public risk. Agnes listened and then looked at Ember, who was still sitting calmly beside Roy's boot, still watching the council table with those pale green eyes. Agnes said the council would step out briefly. They were gone for less than 10 minutes. When they came back, Agnes said the bonding declaration Glenn had prepared would be accepted and filed. She said Ember would be registered under Roy's name as a bonded creature and not classified as a wild risk. She said the matter was closed. Aldrin gathered his papers and left without speaking again. His 2 men followed. Roy thanked the council once, simply, and turned to go. The dock people stood up from the benches and a few of them patted his shoulder as he passed. Dot gave him a firm nod. Pip looked like he might burst from pride on someone else's behalf. Mara walked out beside him without saying anything, which with Mara meant she was satisfied. They walked back down to the dock in the late afternoon light, Roy and Mara and Ember between them. The water was gold and flat. The dock was winding down for the evening. Ropes being coiled. Boats being tied. The smell of salt and wood and the end of a working day.